Good day, everyone, and thank you once again for joining the Animal Welfare Group Nigeria. Today, we have the 14th virtual inaugural lecture of the group. And before I proceed to introduce our speaker to you, I would say once again, you're highly welcome to our platform. The Animal Welfare Group Nigeria was founded in the year 2019 after the gathering of students and researchers. It started at the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Nigeria. And since then, December this year will mark the 5th year that we have been running the program. And I'm happy to say that we have over 90 members now from over 22 affiliations in Nigeria. So you're highly welcome to our group. We have three main missions. The first is to increase awareness in animal behavior and welfare. And secondly, we want to foster collaboration among researchers in animal behavior and welfare in Africa and globally. And the third mission is to educate the public on the importance of animal behavior and welfare. We have been doing this over the 5 years, close to 5 years now, and we are happy that we've had presentations from presenters from all over the world. So if today is your first time joining us, please, you're highly welcome. And like I said, we would like to foster collaboration. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box and let us know where you're joining us from. I am Dr. Iyasiri Oluwaseun Sarah. I'm the host and also the moderator of today's meeting. And I'm an associate professor at the Federal University of Agriculture, Abeokuta, Nigeria. Before I bring up our speaker, I would like to take a biography. Georgia is a professor in the College of Biological Sciences, Department of Integrative Biology. She is a prize-winning behavioral biologist. She studies how animals from mice to elephants adjust to life in captivity. Why do some strive while others show signs of boredom, stress, frustration, and depression? She is also interested in the validation of indicators of animal emotion and animal welfare, such as stereotypic behavior, judgment bias, and facial expressions. Georgia had a first-class degree in zoology from Cambridge University, and she also had a PhD from that same university. She holds a Clare College Research Fellowship, and after which she moved to Oxford Zoology Department, teaching vertebrate biology before taking up a David Phillips Research Fellowship from the BBSRC. Georgia moved to Guelph in 2004 for a Canada research chair, and she has over 200 publications, including a co-authored edited book on stereotypic behavior and papers in Nature, Science, and Proceedings of the Royal Society B. She has been a visiting professor in welfare physiology at the Royal Veterinary College, UK, an honorary research professor at the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa, and served on numerous committees and working groups turning welfare science into policy. Yeah, permit me to welcome Georgia Mason to our midst as she will be delivering the 14th inaugural lecture of the Animal Welfare Group titled, What Do Stereotypic Behaviors Reveal About Animal Welfare? Before I hand over to her to do her presentation, any question you have, kindly drop it in the chat, and the questions will be taken immediately after her presentations. Thank you so much. You're highly welcome, Georgia.
Yeah, lovely to see you as well. I'm sorry I couldn't make it last time. So, greetings from Canada, where it is very early in the morning. Today, I'm going to talk about stereotypic or abnormal repetitive behavior, and I'm going to use these two terms as more or less synonyms. And in my talk, I'm going to include both very repetitive forms like this pacing that you can see here, where the animals trod in exactly the same footsteps over and over again, and the more flexible, less predictable behaviors that we commonly see in captivity, like this self-plucking in a grey parrot. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start with some introductory terms and definitions. covering welfare-related concepts and also some challenges special to abnormal repetitive behavior. Then I'm going to present evidence that abnormal repetitive behavior is indeed a valid welfare indicator by showing that it passes three tests: that it reflects poor welfare when we see it in humans, that it increases in animals exposed to situations that are aversive, or in animals exposed to situations that would threaten their fitness in the wild. But during this, we're going to come across some counterexamples too, and I'm going to try and weave all this into some conclusions, some guidelines for practical use in practice, and I'm going to highlight some future research needs too. So let's start here by clarifying what I mean by welfare and defining affective states, and what it means to validate welfare indicators. And also, I have to acknowledge the undoubted messiness of abnormal repetitive behaviors. Okay, so affective states are the internal states that are at the very heart of welfare, both human welfare and animal welfare. And these are a subgroup of private, subjective experiences or feelings that have a property called valence. And valence basically means value, and it means that they feel positive or negative. In other words, they're either pleasant and preferred feelings or they're unpleasant and aversive feelings. And affective states are central to a whole array of welfare-related phenomena with different timescales and different properties that range from transient states to more long-lasting, almost traits. So at one end of the spectrum, we have emotions and similar states. And emotions are short-lasting states that are clearly related to or caused by specific rewards or punishers. They're often brief, they might last seconds to minutes, and they very closely reflect the presence or absence of specific pleasant or unpleasant stimuli in the environment. So, for example, fear or being scared is an emotion, and fear might be induced by a predator or a challenging social situation or giving a talk, or perhaps a loud bang for this little baby at the top. Another negative emotion-like states include pain and hunger. These are sometimes called homeostatic emotions because they help regulate homeostasis of the body. And positive emotions might include joy at being cuddled, as in the bottom picture. And in everyday life, we can detect emotions by their effect on facial expressions and vocalizations. And if we're welfare scientists, we can also detect them through rapidly changing aspects of physiology, like heart rate or corticosteroids. Longer lasting affective states are called moods, and these might last from minutes to days, and they're typically not induced by just any one clear stimulus, but instead by an array of preceding emotions over an earlier period of time. So if you've had many positive emotions in the previous week, your partner gave you flowers, your boss gave you praise, you had a delicious meal out, and that kind of thing, this will put you in a good mood that's not caused by any one of these things. It's caused by the sort of integration of many positive emotions. And examples of positive moods might be contentment or feelings of peace that aren't necessarily about or caused by just one stimulus. Examples of negative moods, in contrast, would include feeling anxious or depressed or just all-round gloomy, general sort of feelings of dread or of just being overwhelmed by everything. Again, these aren't necessarily caused by any one thing, but instead having many negative emotions tends to trigger negative moods. And we can often detect moods by their effects on general activity. Are individuals agitated or instead lethargic? And also on types of reactivity or thresholds for responding that almost seem like changes in personality, such as irritability or fearfulness or readiness to smile. And if we're scientists, we can also assess moods in tests for anxiety, say, or tests for judgment bias. But affective states are important over longer timescales too, and that's because repeated or prolonged negative moods caused by sustained adversity, many tough things happening to you in your life, can have negative consequences on mental and physical health via so-called cumulative stress. And this is the accumulation of the impacts of negative life events. And these effects can accelerate cellular aging, sometimes visibly manifest in aging skin and graying hair, as we see here in poor Obama, who was pretty much beaten up by 8 years being in the presidential office. And these effects aren't just important because they can affect your physical appearance, they matter in terms of health and survival as well. So here we see survival data from 265 presidents and 255 runner-ups who were similar in age and status and background, but who didn't make it to the office of president. So people who served are shown in the blue line. People who did not serve, their running mates, their rivals rather, are in the top line. And what we can see here is that 20 years after the date of an election, only 40% of presidents are still alive, whereas 60% of their runner-ups are still going strong. And this is a classic effect of the cumulative stress of sustained adversity, because sustained adversity is a major risk factor for numerous physical diseases, things like cancer, stroke, cardiovascular disease. And repeated chronic stress is also a risk factor for mental health disorders as well. Things like anxiety, major depressive disorder, and obsessive compulsive disorder. These are all mood disorders which bring with them increased risks of mortality as well. And imaging studies show that these effects on mood disorders are often accompanied by, or sometimes caused by, stress-related changes in the brain. So in humans or animals showing signs of cumulative stress, we might then say that they've had a relatively poor quality of life. And I'm running this past you because it helps us understand the welfare importance of abnormal repetitive behaviours. So I'm going to be arguing that individual bouts of these strange behaviours don't really tell you anything reliable about transient negative emotions, moment-to-moment changes in welfare states. That's not really the relevant timescale. Instead, I'm going to argue that the link with welfare is more that longer-term mood or mood disorders or even cumulative stress change animals' behavioral phenotypes, making them more prone to repetitive behavior. Okay, but what gives me the courage to say such things? Obviously, I'm not Dr. Dolittle. I can't talk to animals. And what I'm going to be running past you is ways in which we can validate welfare indicators and so that we can legitimately use them to infer animals' welfare states from. And when linking any potential welfare indicator to actual well-being, there are 5 validatory methods available. And these have been developed in a book coming out next year on validating welfare indicators in the U4 Wiley series that's edited by myself, Mike Mendel from Bristol, and Beate Nielsen from U4. So one such validatory test would be, does my potential welfare indicator track or correspond to poor well-being in humans? Because humans can tell us how they feel. Humans are a great model for other species. Another test is, does my potential welfare indicator reliably increase when animals are exposed to aversive treatments? That is, treatments we can see they'd rather escape from. A third validatory test is my potential welfare indicator increased by threats to fitness, things that would threaten my animal's fitness in the wild? And this is based on an assumption that affective states have evolved to promote and protect fitness. And we can also ask too, though I won't cover this today for brevity, we can ask, is my potential welfare indicator reduced by drugs that improved welfare, such as anxiolytics or painkillers? And we can ask whether a potential welfare indicator co-varies with other already validated welfare indicators. And the more tests an indicator passes, the more confident we can be when we use it. And ways in which it fails can also give us some rules for how to use it in practice And it will fail in some regards because there isn't any single perfect welfare indicator, as I'm sure you know. Okay, the final bit of my sort of introductory spiel is to acknowledge the messiness of abnormal repetitive behaviors. Now, abnormal repetitive behaviors are a very kind of messy, frustrating categories in a couple of inconvenient ways. The first is that it's not quite clear where to draw the boundaries, what falls into this group. So, for example, wheel running is highly motivated. Often we see it as a form of enrichment use in rodents and other species, but it's very repetitive, it seems kind of pointless. It's obviously not seen in wild animals. So, is it an abnormal repetitive behavior, or is it just a repetitive behavior and not abnormal? Also, some unusual, disturbing behaviors might not be that repetitive. So, a caged monkey might occasionally bite himself or just lift one limb in the air and hold it in a strange pose. Is that an abnormal, repetitive behavior, or is it just an abnormal behavior? So here I'm just not going to worry about that too much. I'm just going to say that abnormal repetitive behaviors are repeated actions that differ in kind or degree from what would be seen in naturalistic environments or preferred environments. It's pretty loose, but that's okay, because the real question is, which of these reveal welfare problems? Okay, so what's included as a problem? The other problem is that they're extremely heterogeneous. So if we think about people, even normal neurotypical people, repetitive behaviors can be seen and they're pretty diverse. They look different, they feel different. So some of us might bite our nails, some of us might pace. And in people with clinical conditions typified by abnormal repetitive behavior, so here a child tragically raised in a terrible institutional environment, they're even more diverse and they reflect different forms of brain dysfunction. And these very different forms are often studied by different research groups or even different types of researchers asking different questions and using different methods. So this can make comparison across these diverse behaviors very challenging. So I'm going to acknowledge that they're not all the same, they're heterogeneous. And this means that here I'm just going to be giving you broad brushstrokes recommendations that pretty much apply to all, but should be taken as working hypotheses rather than as gospel truths for every single form. Okay, so this is my recommendation to you. So everything I say from now on should be taken as roughly right, a good rule of thumb, and a reasonable working assumption or a sensible hypothesis to test with the particular abnormal repetitive behaviors that you yourself are faced with and are interested in. Okay, so at last to the meat of the talk, let's think about welfare. So what do repetitive behaviors reveal about welfare in humans? So I mentioned some of the things that all of us probably do. Probably some of you out there, some of you might be twiddling a pen or joggling your knee. And this is fine. They're very common. They don't mean you're abnormal. They don't necessarily mean you're in trouble. Now, scientists aren't quite sure really what these behaviors represent. They're often loosely called displacement behaviors. But what's interesting about these is they can be welfare relevant, as I will describe next. And the very first evidence of this came from a study in the 1940s that showed that the onset of World War II had an impact on young Americans, that college students who were observed while taking tests for behaviors like lip biting, hair twisting, and so on, were more prone to these behaviors during a period in which they or their loved ones could be called up to fight. These behaviors were more common then than they were before the war or after the war. 3 or 4 decades later, other studies started collecting similar data, and these painted a broadly similar picture that chronic situations of poor welfare increase the severity and prevalence of repetitive behaviors. So, as one example, college students who admitted to body rocking reported higher levels of general distress and anxiety than their peers who didn't do this behavior. And repetitive behaviors are also seen in children who are enduring long periods of stress, either at home or at school, or in children moved away from family homes into residential care. Furthermore, the imprisonment of adults, obviously an unpleasant experience, also dramatically increases repetitive behaviors. So in one study of prisoners prisoners of war who experienced solitary confinement, 64% reported pacing, 60% repetitively exercised, and 73% performed what they called ritualistic activities. And present pacing is prevalent as well in incarcerated criminals in today's prisons. So a take-home message is that even in neurotypical people, repetitive behaviors become more likely and more time-consuming during long-lasting periods of reduced welfare. But normal human data give us a couple of caveats as well. So one is that the immediate triggers of bouts of these behaviors may themselves not be that negative. They can be pretty diverse. They can be negative, but they can also be positive. So people tend to lapse into these actions, yes, when they're upset or when they're agitated, but also during moments of calm or concentration. Watching television might be one example, or when they're super excited. So this gives us an insight that repetitive behaviors do not reliably indicate moment-to-moment changes in negative emotion in humans. The other caveat is that even in identical difficult situations, not everyone does these behaviors, and people vary a lot in how prone they are to doing these. For example, we saw that in prisoners of war, maybe 2/3 of people showed repetitive behaviors, even though presumably being a prisoner of war in isolation is horrible for 100% of people. So why are a fraction of people not doing repetitive behaviors even when their welfare is poor? Now, we don't know for sure, but there's a couple of clues out there in the literature. We can see that there are predispositions in many people's brains to perform habits and routines, and children who are more prone to routines are more prone to repetitive behaviors. We can also see that in times of duress, some people don't become hyperactive and repetitive, and instead they become quiet and withdrawn and apathetic. And their welfare is still compromised, they're just displaying it in a different kind of way. So this gives us another take-home message that repetitive behaviors can indicate poor conditions at a group level, but across identically treated individuals, they might not tell you reliably which particular people are the worse off. All right, so we're going to see that similar lessons emerge when we look at neuroatypical people, sometimes referred to as clinical populations. Now, these are the types of people who were studied intensively by psychologists, psychiatrists, and neuroscientists. And compared to neurotypical people, thanks to profound changes in the brain, abnormal repetitive behaviors are much more prevalent and they're much more time-consuming. And examples of conditions typified by this include autistic spectrum disorder. And here we see a famous welfare researcher, Temple Grandin, who has this condition, obsessive compulsive disorder, trichotillomania, which is hair plucking, and also the syndromes induced by being raised in incredibly deprived rearing environments. Now, all of these conditions are distinct from each other. The repetitive behaviors involved across all of them are diverse. Some get called compulsions, some mannerisms, some stereotypies. And I'm not saying that all are the same, but nevertheless, research on all of them has generated some common concepts and findings. So I should acknowledge that in many cases, the primary cause of repetitive behavior is completely unrelated to welfare. Often it's genetic, sometimes it could be autoimmune, sometimes it could be exposure to neurotoxic chemicals. But despite this, all of these groups are typified by high levels of anxiety and depression. Furthermore, affective states do play an important causal role in exacerbating repetitive behaviors. And furthermore, in the case of children raised in terrible conditions, poor welfare arguably was the primary cause of their problems. Okay, so let's dive into some of these examples and look at their relationship with welfare. So, as I just mentioned, in severely deprived children, compromised brain development gives rise to abnormal repetitive behaviors, and it reflects profound poor welfare, at least early in life. And the most well-studied example come from the group of so-called Romanian orphans. And these are little children who, in the 1980s, in the terrible regime of Nicolae Ceausescu, hundreds of thousands of these children were raised in institutions where they had little social contact, no affection, no chances to play, and they were physically and nutritionally restricted, sometimes even being tethered into their cots. And I think it's obvious that this was very bad for their welfare at the time. But just in case you doubt it, the experience increased signs of cellular aging and also made the children empirically more anxious. And repetitive behaviors like rocking and head banging were very common in these conditions. And some children continued with these repetitive actions even after they were rescued and adopted into normal family homes. And three factors predicted how persistent their abnormal behaviors would be. One was how long they'd lived in the terrible institutional conditions. A second was how long they were in their new normal family home. The less time they were there, the less cured they would be. And the other was the relationship they had with their new carers. Those who didn't develop affectionate, secure bonds recovered the slowest. So we can see that welfare in childhood is then having a powerful relationship with repetitive behaviors in these children. But what about conditions where genetics plays a primary role? So genetic background is the major risk factor for autistic spectrum disorder, trichotillomania, and obsessive compulsive disorder. But stressful early experiences still play a major role, at very least in trichotillomania and OCD, possibly in an autistic spectrum disorder as well, although this is less certain. And so, for example, a consistent research finding is that compared to age and sex match controls, people with trichotillomania and OCD in adulthood experience significantly more stressful events in their childhood. And these are clearly having lasting consequences. But do traumas after childhood have effects too? The answer is yes. So if we look at trichotillomania, people who hair pluck typically, again, compared with sex-matched, age-matched controls, have experienced more terrible events over their lifetime. So one study suggested people who hair pluck have had 4 serious traumas in their life compared to just 2.5 in control subjects. And another study found that within subjects with trichotillomania, being exposed to more past traumas predicted a more severe manifestation of trichotillomania. People with this condition are also very often depressed, and statistical models show that trichotillomania is made worse by past trauma because this trauma increases depression. So unpleasant experiences reduce welfare, and that reduced welfare is causing this hair plucking disorder. Similar data are present for obsessive compulsive disorders, such as compulsive hand washing. And here again, compared with controls, people with OCD have experienced more past stressful life events. And within subjects with OCD, people who've had more stressful life events in their past have more severe forms of the disease. So incredibly similar to trichotillomania. This is less well studied in autism. It's less clear that there's such direct patterns, but there's lots of speculation that similar things are happening. And we do know that people with autism who also show lots of abnormal repetitive behavior are more anxious. That anxiety and abnormal repetitive behavior are linked in people with autism, and they also report poorer life satisfaction. So what we can see is even in these conditions with strong genetic components, repetitive behaviors are more severe in people who are anxious and people who've had severe stressor exposure in their past. But we can also see a couple of lessons similar to what we saw for normal humans. First of all, not everyone is the same, and not everyone exposed to traumatic childhoods or anxious lives develops repetitive behaviors. So back to the Romanian orphans, only 50 to 80% of children developed abnormal repetitive behaviors, not 100%, even though presumably welfare was compromised for 100% of the children. And if we look at people who've experienced trauma in their lives, it's estimated that 30 to 70% of adults have experienced trauma in their lives, yet only 1 to 2% of people will develop OCD or trichotillomania. So what's happening here? Well, just as for neurotypical humans, repetitive behaviors do indicate past trauma, but they also miss cases of past trauma in people who show different responses instead. Some people may develop depression, for example, in which they become very inactive rather than repetitive. So just as for neurotypical humans, using repetitive behaviors to identify the lowest welfare subjects is an error. It risks us overlooking subjects who also have poor welfare. They just don't display it like this. But people with lots of repetitive behaviors, that is a warning sign of a tough past life. Furthermore, except for the compulsions of OCD, individual bouts of repetitive behavior aren't necessarily prompted by negative emotions. In autistic spectrum disorder, for example, repetitive behaviors called stimming are common during moments of calmness, and they're often perceived as being rather pleasant to do. So this means that just as for neurotypical humans, repetitive behaviors in these clinical subjects do not reliably indicate transient negative emotions. What they do indicate is longer-term past welfare. Okay, so those were some lessons from humans. Are we going to see them mirrored in the data from animals? So here I'm just going to cherry pick some examples for you of cases where abnormal repetitive behaviors are very clearly increased by aversive treatments or by threats to fitness in animals. And I'm also going to show you some counterexamples as well. And then I'm going to weave them together to give you some take-home messages. So first of all, are abnormal repetitive behaviors in animals increased by aversive treatments? So these are treatments we know animals would avoid if they could. And there are many, many examples where the answer here is yes. And examples include prolonged food deprivation that causes frustrated, strong motivations to eat. We know the animals want to escape from this situation and eat, but they can't. Other examples include frightening interactions or situations where humans are being frightening, or there's aggression from conspecifics that animals can't escape from. And several examples also come from animals in barren environments that we know they don't like being in, that we know they'd like to escape from to get to more complex, enriched environments. So let me give you some examples, and I'm going to start with undesirable food deprivation. So, studies of the role of food deprivation in abnormal repetitive behavior represent some of the very earliest animal studies, actually. Some classic work on sows done by people like Alistair Lawrence and Jeff Rushin in the 1980s. And here on the x-axis, we can see levels of food allowance going from 4 kilograms a day, which is roughly ad lib, down to 2 kilograms a day, at which point animals are really very hungry. And what we can see is the more hungry the animals, the more further away they are from desired food levels, the more abnormal behavior they show. They show abnormal oral forms, as is seen here. As a little side note, that's not the only influence on repetitive pigs. On the z-axis here, we can also see an impact of neighbours. So if neighbours are very active and repetitive, this too promotes abnormal repetitive behaviour in subjects, and we're not really sure why. Does that reflect negative welfare, or is it just activating? So that's a little side note. But back to food deprivation, pigs are a classic example, but there's many similar effects in other species. So we see it in calves who also do oral movements. We see it in carnivores such as mink, and we see it in birds, the best studied being broiler breeders who are often chronically food deprived. So chronic hunger promotes abnormal repetitive behaviors, but being fed or expecting food can also trigger bouts of the behavior. And so I think expecting food or even getting food probably is a rather nice thing for these animals. And I'm going to say here that showing lots of abnormal repetitive behavior is bad, but individual bouts probably don't track negative emotions in any reliable way. It's the abnormal repetitive phenotype that's the problem rather than what triggers particular bouts. And I think the way in which meals promote abnormal repetitive behavior is a nice example of this lesson we learned from humans. Okay, let's look at other aversive situations. Being exposed to aggression is another example. So here, in my lab a while ago, we housed C57 mice, these little black mice as shown here, in two ways. They were housed in two interconnected cages that had many resources spread across the two cages, as shown in the bottom, or all these resources were crushed into one single cage where they were very crowded, and only one wheel was presented in this clustered condition. And we looked to see how clustered, diminished resources compared with dispersed, more uh, more more well-provisioned enrichments. And a couple of things happened. One is that in the top condition, mice became much more aggressive. Levels of aggression increased about threefold because the mice are constantly pushing each other off at the resources and competing for access to these enrichments. Correspondingly, abnormal repetitive behaviors increased about fourfold in the clustered resource cages. And these abnormal behaviors co-varied with aggression. Cages in which there was the most aggression were also cages in which there was the most abnormal repetitive behavior. These poor mice couldn't escape from each other, and abnormal repetitive behavior was the result. In another species, the mink, we see something similar. So male mink are naturally solitary and highly territorial, and I'm going to assume that having other males close by is therefore highly aversive. And in fur farm conditions, male mink perform much more of this intense scrabbling behavior if their neighbours are close by rather than distant, and if their neighbours are male rather than female. So it looks here as though being exposed to rival males who you can't escape from triggers this abnormal repetitive behavior of scrabbling. What about physical harms that can't be escaped from, including harms from humans? Well, this has been best studied in rhesus monkeys and chimpanzees used in biomedical research. And here, some large-scale analyses of large data sets show that Primates who've been repeatedly exposed to multiple research projects, which would have involved multiple inescapable harms, end up showing more severe, more prevalent abnormal repetitive behavior. Though I have to admit, we don't always replicate these findings, and it may be that some abnormal behaviors reflect this that other ones don't. Turning at last to aversive housing conditions, barren conditions that we know are not preferred are a classic trigger for abnormal repetitive behavior. So abnormal repetitive behavior increases in barren cages like these ones on the left, in bank voles and lab mice. And in both these species, we know that they prefer to be in large complex cages like this. In mice, we'll know that they'll even push weights as heavy as their own body weights to reach cages like this. And similarly for mink, if mink are housed in barren cages like this, or instead given the opportunity to climb a tower, cross a tunnel, and reach enriched compartments in which they have flowing water to swim in and objects to chew, novel objects, plastic things, even old trainers that they can destroy. We know that mink very much like doing these things. Again, they'll push heavy weights in order to reach them. And animals who are housed in these preferred conditions show much lower levels of abnormal repetitive behavior than animals that are squished into small barren cages. So aversive housing conditions are a classic trigger. And for some examples of abnormal behavior, we know that multiple aversive stimuli can exacerbate them. So for example, in wheel running, we see that wheel running in mice is higher in barren cages than in preferred enriched ones. It's higher in animals exposed to human noise or predator cues or rough handling by people, or aggression. And it's also higher in animals deprived of food or deprived of mates, or if they're alcohol addicted, deprived of alcohol. So many forms of deprivation can trigger the same abnormal repetitive behavior. Are there counterexamples? Of course there are. Just as in humans, not all individuals placed into aversive conditions react by becoming repetitive. So if we look at cages like this for mink, which we know they don't like being in, mink here, they're not preferred. Mink here are more stereotypic on average. They also show higher levels of corticosteroid production. They show more fluctuating asymmetry, showing a chronic stress during development. And they show smaller thymuses and spleens, indicating less good immune systems. Yet in these conditions, some minks show a lot of abnormal repetitive behavior, some only show a bit, and some don't even show any at all. And this individual variation reveals nothing about welfare. The mink with the most abnormal repetitive behavior in these conditions don't have the smallest spleens. They're not the most asymmetrical. They don't have the highest corticosteroid. They're not the most fearful, for example. Furthermore, and perhaps relatedly, some animals react to aversive conditions not by becoming hyperactive, but instead by becoming inactive. That's what we see in the mink. It's also what we see in some groups of animals. So if, for example, you catch African striped mice from the wild and you plonk them in cages, they will hardly show any abnormal repetitive behavior, even though their offspring, born in captivity, will show loads. And what the wild caught animals are doing instead is that they're hiding because they're scared of people. So some individuals are just quiet and subdued instead of being highly repetitive. Okay, let's turn now to my second test of validity. Are abnormal repetitive behaviors increased by threats to fitness? And this is assuming that factors that would threaten fitness in an animal's ancestors cause negative affective states because negative effects have evolved to get you out of trouble, basically. And we have the highest quality data from animals who have lost their mothers prematurely, something that would be devastating for fitness in the wild, social animals who are isolated, again, which would be devastating for fitness in the wild, and we have some data from animals who are sick or injured. Now, obviously, all of these treatments are presumably also aversive. Animals would escape from them if they could, but we just lack experimental evidence here. Okay, so losing the mother prematurely has been best studied in primates. And in the 1960s, there were some fairly terrible examples of primates who were reared without any mother at all, or indeed without any conspecifics at all. And these animals grew up to be profoundly abnormal with really severe repetitive behaviors like rocking and eye poking and self-biting, and they carried on being at risk even into adulthood. Now, hardly anyone has done such severe treatments to animals since, but in many other studies, the mother isn't taken away completely, but she might be taken away early. And even this would threaten fitness in the wild because the young animal would have a reduced chance of surviving. And we can see in many species that early loss of the mother has lasting effects on abnormal repetitive behavior, even into adulthood. We see this in chimpanzees, we see this in laboratory mice, we see this in mink, we see this in pet dogs and pet cats. So it seems to be ubiquitous in mammals, or almost ubiquitous. I'm going to give you one exception. There is one species, pig-tailed macaques, in which it's been reported that early loss of the mother doesn't trigger repetitive behavior. Instead, the animals become very slumped and withdrawn and very inactive. So, one little exception here. I'm going to skip this for time actually, and I'm going to say that there are similar effects of maternal loss in birds as well. So compared to poultry chicks reared with just their peers in an incubator, those reared with their mothers, when they grow up, are less likely to become feather peckers, and they spend less time in the behavior once they reach the pullet phase. A small-scale study of the highly endangered Hawaiian crow also suggests that being reared in isolation without a mother increases abnormal repetitive behaviors in adulthood, like spinning and body flipping. And there's similar suggestions from grey parrots and from starlings as well. Okay, so that dealt with parental loss. What about being isolated for social animals? So social animals have evolved to live in groups because that's what's best for fitness in the wild. And to isolate such animals is highly abnormal. For us, it would be very aversive. And this has been best studied again in primates. So we can see that in primates, in laboratory animals, behaviors like self-biting are much, much, much more common in animals who are kept on their own rather than in a group. And instead of just looking at current conditions and we look back at a whole lifespan of animals, if we look across the lifespan of rhesus monkeys who were used over and over again in research experiments, controlling for age, more severe, prevalent abnormal repetitive behaviors are seen in animals who've been more socially isolated over their lifespan and who've had more breakages of social bonds. So they've been partnered up and then they've lost their social partner. They've been partnered up again, they've lost their social partner again. Animals who've been through a lot of these social disruptions or a lot of social isolation end up in the here and now end up being extremely abnormal. And this isn't just true for primates. If we look at elephants in zoos, both Asian elephants shown in the top line and African elephants shown in the bottom line, these are model fit patterns showing the relationship between how much time animals are spent on their own and how much time they spend in abnormal repetitive behavior across 89 elephants in 39 North American zoos. And what we can see is that proportion of time spent on their own predicts how much abnormal repetitive behavior animals show. And further analyses show it's not just present conditions that are important, but just like for primates, it's past social isolation or social disruption as well. So here we can see that for elephants, again, Asian on the top, African on the bottom, who've been through a number of inter-zoo transfers, which means they keep making friends, losing them, being put in a new group, losing that group, being put in a new group, losing that group again. The more times their social environment is being disrupted, the more repetitive behaviors like swaying and head bobbing they will show in the here and now as well. And as a final rodent example, if we look at deer mice, these show data for deer mice studied across 63 days, so 2 months, either in large enriched environments like this or small barren laboratory cages. And we can see that typically being kept in barren laboratory cages makes them more prone to repetitive behavior like repetitive jumping. But the benefits of enrichment vanish if these animals are isolated for a day a week and put in a little test chamber to record their stereotypic jumping. These poor animals who've been exposed to this repeated social isolation become as abnormally stereotypic as animals who are constantly kept in barren conditions. And finally, in some cases from zoo animals, we sometimes see that animals who are sick or injured show more abnormal repetitive behaviors. And examples come from animals who've had gastrointestinal disease or dental pain or mastitis in a nursing leopard. And in these cases, veterinarians were warned that something was wrong with their physical health because their behavior became so abnormally repetitive, and treating their physical clinical conditions helped alleviate their abnormal repetitive behavior. Though I'm going to guess that this hasn't often been reported, because I'm going to guess there's a lot of exceptions here, because typically animals who are sick or in pain are often likely to become extremely inactive. They're not going to be pacing, they're going to be huddling in a miserable corner somewhere. Okay, so let me try and wrap this up for you. What are my conclusions and guidelines for use in practice? So I want to first remind us that strange repetitive behaviors have been seen as disturbing and wrong for decades. So this is an image taken by enlightened zoo director Heini Heidegger, working in, it was either Austria or Germany in the 1950s. This is a classic pace in a carnivore, often sparked by the expectation of food, which isn't necessarily bad, but most prolonged if animals are hungry, most prolonged in cages if cages are small and barren, and if they're like mink, exacerbated by the early loss of a mother. So people have long recognized that these behaviors are worrying. And as potential welfare indicators, they've got some real bonuses. They're non-invasive, they're easy to assess, they're also kind of intuitive. But I think they've kind of dropped out of favor in recent years, and behaviors like this today aren't always used in welfare assessment because I think our communities got a bit confused by the complexities of their links with welfare and sometimes even the confusing counter evidence that we can see. And so they're not that fashionable today. Everyone wants to look at judgment bias. So I'm going to argue that I think we should re-embrace abnormal repetitive behavior as a welfare indicator. When we see animals like this, we should worry and we should look critically at how they were treated throughout their whole lives, and we should rectify this in the future. So I'm going to give you some guidelines as to why things in the past have seemed confusing and what can help clarify links with welfare. So abnormal repetitive behaviors are easier to think about in welfare terms. If you think about the time scales of different affective states and you ignore transient emotions and you think about mood and cumulative stress and quality of life, You think about the comparisons being made and use them to compare treatments and experiences, not individual animals or genotypes. That relatedly, you recognize that inactivity is likely to be a confound or an alternate response to negative experiences, and therefore recognize that abnormal repetitive behaviors are sometimes going to be false and prone to false nulls as welfare indicators. Their presence is always worrying, but their absence is not always reassuring. So let me delve into this in more detail and give you some take-home messages for how to use these in practice. And these are also hypotheses to test in any specific example that you've got that you want to try and understand more. So typically, high or prevalent abnormal repetitive behavior in a group of similarly treated animals is likely to indicate low moods and possibly cumulative stress over a lifespan. We've seen that it often reflects threats to fitness and aversive treatments, sometimes even from infancy to the present day in a kind of cumulative effect. Oops, sorry, too many animations. However, high ARB is not a good way to identify poor welfare individuals within a group of identically treated animals, all else being equal. It identifies poor long-term treatments at the group level, but it doesn't identify which individual animals are most in trouble. That's because individuals and strains and species can vary in their propensity for abnormal repetitive behavior for reasons that are nothing to do with welfare, how active they are, how routine prone they are. So use abnormal repetitive behavior to identify suboptimal treatments, not to identify high or low welfare animals within that treatment group. High or prevalent abnormal repetitive behavior is also not a good way to identify transient negative emotions, short-term states. Yes, they may sometimes increase in subjects who are upset or experiencing negative events, but they may well be performed during transient neutral or even exciting events. So be aware that it's the high ARB phenotype that's the worry, not each individual ARB bout. Be aware that high or prevalent ARB is prone to false nulls, false negatives, when you're using it as a welfare indicator. And that's because some animals will adopt other responses. In particular, they might become very inactive. And inactivity may also occur during some negative experiences, things like sickness or pain, and perhaps extreme heat. It would be silly to become hyperactive if you're very hot. And so, lastly, silly animations, the absence of ARB is thus a necessary but not sufficient. It's necessary but not sufficient for inferring good welfare. So if you see them, you should worry. If you don't see them, don't be complacent. Okay, so I want to wrap up with a couple of future research needs, because obviously these behaviors are complex. They're also tragically understudied, I think. First and foremost, I think we need more research on mechanism to understand the potential parallels between captive animals and neuroatypical humans. Are we effectively creating animals who are like the Romanian orphans or like people with trichotillomania because we've exposed them to early and repeated stresses over their lifetime? So that's one research need. Then when it comes to using them in welfare assessment, my hunch is that statistically controlling for activity levels will make abnormal repetitive behavior a more responsive, more reliable welfare indicator. But is that hypothesis correct? Only future research will tell. Okay, so that is me for today. I hope I've convinced you that abnormal repetitive behaviors at the group level are a really worrying, evidence-backed way to infer low moods or even cumulative stress in groups of animals that have been treated poorly. And we really need to take these behaviors seriously. Thanks very much. And I would love to answer any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Georgia, for this interesting presentation. It's quite eye-opening to, understand what stereotypic behaviors actually are. And thank you also for talking us through from the human perspective, into the animal research that have to do with stereotypic behavior. I think we have questions in the chat, which I'll be taking soon. I just want to ask you this question. Can you, in simple term, help differentiate between emotions and mood?
Yeah, so emotions are short term, they're transient and they're elicited by particular stimuli. So you might be frightened of a particular thing, and then once that thing goes, you're no longer frightened. A mood is a longer lasting state that's become somewhat divorced from what's immediately happening in the current environment. So a mood effectively integrates emotions over the past days or weeks or even months. So a mood might be something like anxiety, and that anxiety is typically caused by many bad things happening to you that have caused negative emotions. And anxiety is manifest as not being frightened by any one thing, but by being generally fearful of everything. So a mood is a longer lasting state.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Thank you so much. Thank you so
Yeah,
much. So
great.
I'm here in the chat from Elena. Have researchers found ARBs in cows, especially cows separated from cows upon birth or shortly after birth?
Well, in calves, we see non-nutritive sucking, which is a very common oral ARB, and this is more common in calves that are fed low levels of milk and calves that are fed from a bucket instead of a naturalistic teat. Then in adulthood, it seems that abnormal repetitive behaviors are either not studied or they're not seen. And one thing I know is that there are massive breed differences. So it seems like Jersey cows show a lot, and I don't really know why, whereas Friesians and Holsteins seem to show far few. And it'd be fascinating to know why. I'm gonna, my hunch would be these don't reflect breed differences in welfare, but instead they reflect breed differences in response style. So I'm going to suggest that Jersey cows are probably just more active and more routine prone, and maybe Friesians and Holsteins are more prone to being quiet and depressed in response to repeated stress over the lifetime. But yeah, it'd be fascinating to look more. Um, yeah, great question.
Thank you so much. A question here from Oladepo. The discussion is well appreciated. Thank you. How can ARB in lab animals be managed? And does ARB usually affect all drug screening in animals?
Okay, so how can they be managed? Well, probably by being left with the mother for longer. We know that in primates, we suspect it for rodents. And then being in a large naturalistic cage, so full of preferred resources. I try not to use the word enriched. In talking about enriched and enrichments is really common. I hate that term because it makes it sound like a luxury. We should keep them in good cages that have what they need, and that will make them cognitively and effectively normal and less prone to repetitive behaviors. In primates, we also need to use them less often. So they're often used in multiple research projects, which expose them to multiple stresses over their lifetime, and that's a cumulative risk factor. We don't know if that's true for rodents because nobody's looked as yet. So basically, they need to be treated better over their whole lifespan. How is that for an answer? Then I think you were asking, do they affect results, research results? Nobody really knows. So people have suggested it over and over again. Joe Garner has suggested it for primates. Melissa Bateson and Colleen Poirier have suggested it for research primates. Sorry, Joe for rodents, Melissa and Colleen for primates. It does seem intuitive that, especially if these involve brain dysfunction, that these animals then no longer model normal humans. And typically it's normal humans who we're trying to understand in biomedical research. but we don't know yet. We
Mm.
don't know. I'm doing a
What
little bit of work on this now, but you'll have to wait. You have to invite me back for another talk.
problem? No problem. You're welcome anytime. I think there is a question here that you have not really addressed. Does ARB usually affect all drug screening in animals? Do
I
you have any
don't
idea? Okay.
I don't know. I don't know. So I was just including that in just general research results. I don't know.
Okay.
Great question. Don't know. I'm gonna guess yes. More research. I should have added that to my list.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. So there's a question here from Sarah. As you mentioned, the absence of ARB is not always reassuring, and we know that an indicator on its own it's of little value. What other indicators would you advise to pair with ARB to assess the welfare of wild animals under human care, especially those not displaying ARB?
So that's a great question. So I would be interested in indicators sensitive to anxiety or depression. So, for example, do animals seem fearful of multiple stimuli? Do they show exaggerated startle responses? I'd be interested in indicators sensitive to depression. So, do they show um, reduced hippocampal volume, for example? Do they show reduced responsiveness to rewarding stimuli, which might indicate anhedonia? And do they also show negative judgment biases? If you have a validated judgment bias task, which is difficult to get, but potentially very valuable, do they have negative judgment biases? You might also, if you have time, look to see, are they more vulnerable to physical health problems, and do they live less long, actually? And I would predict that conditions conditions that are poor for welfare over a lifespan are typically going to curtail life, actually. So if you've got zoo records you can look at, or you've got short-lived animals that you can house for a long time, you would predict shorter health spans and shorter lifespans. Shorter health spans, shorter lifespans, yeah.
Okay, let me ask this question before I go back into the chat. Each species, they have a different let me see kind of behavior. But in
Yeah.
terms of stereotypic behavior, is it can we actually say in monkeys when they exhibit stereotypic behavior, it can only be this kind of behavior? Or can you find a similar kind of stereotypic behavior exhibited in primates, also in rodents, or something like that?
Oh, that's a great question. So yeah, there are taxonomic predictors of the forms that we see. So for example, carnivores typically pace, and they typically pace before they get food. And it seems that this is derived from an escape response. Um, Rodents typically backflip, bar mouth, pull out the fur of cage mates. Primates show a diverse number of things as well. Ungulates tend to show oral movements that seem to represent attempts to forage. So there are species typical types, and they can sometimes give you clues as to the primary problem underlying the behavior, but I think they don't always. I think sometimes what happens is repeated stresses make the animal's brain abnormal, and then what becomes repetitive are highly motivated behaviors, even if they're not the primary problem. So it's really fascinating looking at species differences. And I think that's where data from zoos can really give us some nice insights.
Yeah, talking about data from zoos, like you said, but in one of your is it the conclusions now, you said it's not good using this on individual animals, right? But it's better when you have group animals. But I've noticed that in some zoos, you still have some animals that are reared in isolation. So how will you?
Yeah, I didn't mean in social groups, actually. I meant that abnormal repetitive behaviors are a good way to identify poor treatments. So if you see in a group of identically treated animals, if ARBs are common, you know that that's not a good treatment. But within identically treated animals, so I showed you the example of mink on a mink farm. They're all taken from their mothers at the same age. They're all kept in the same cage. You see individual variation, like you did in prisoners of war. And the animals who aren't doing it aren't fine. They're not the ones who are happy in their cage. They're just manifesting their poor welfare in a different way.
Mm.
So with zoo animals, it's complicated because when you see individual differences, they reflect idiosyncratic propensities of the individual animal combined with their own personal history. Because zoo animals often they'll be taken from their mothers at different ages, their birth environments will be very diverse. There's subsequent history, how often they've been moved between zoos, how good those environments were that they lived in the past will all be very varying. The treatments they were exposed to, whether they were good or bad, will help determine how stereotypic they are now, but so too will their individual predispositions. That's the complexity. So yes. So I guess what I'm saying is use abnormal behaviors to identify poor treatments, but don't use them, for example, to go to argue, I'm going to worry about that animal, but not animal. I'm going to genetically select from this animal, but not animal. If you do that, you're probably just going to select for animals who are very inactive and you're just masking the problem. You're not solving the problem. Does that make more
Yes,
sense?
I get you now. Yeah, thank
Okay.
you. I get it. I get it now. So a question from Anna here. What are your thoughts on the idea that animals that present ARBs are in a better welfare state than animals that present mostly inactivity and don't connect to the environment? Uh,
Yeah, I think sometimes true. I don't think it's always true, but I do think it's sometimes true. I think sometimes in identically treated animals who are all in a bad environment, the ones who develop ARB sometimes show signs of coping better. They might be bolder, they might reproduce more readily. For example, in some species, we have good evidence of this. And there's two possible explanations that aren't mutually exclusive, so both could be true. One is that doing the behaviors could help the animal. So it could be that doing the behaviors helps substitute for natural behaviors they want to do and they can't. So they just invent their own substitute. Also, we know from humans that just physical exercise is good for your mental health. It can reduce anxiety and depression and protect the brain. So it could be that just the physical exercise of doing things like pacing helps animals cope with poor welfare. The other is it could be that the animals who spontaneously don't do this response are just, they don't do it because they're in even a worse way. They're too terrified to emerge from their den, or they're too depressed to even move. They're just in a kind of apathetic slump. So it could be that it's predispositions and then consequences both play a role here. So I think, I think that's a really great hypothesis to test. In any group of identically treated animals, I suspect you're going to find the spontaneously weirdest looking ones are probably not going to be the worst off, and they might even be the best off. Doesn't mean they're okay, but it means they're
yeah.
relatively.
So like Anna said, it means that the display of this repetitive behavior could also be seen as a survival mechanism or a coping strategy, right? In
Yeah,
some cases.
yeah, I mean, people have suggested that these behaviors help animals cope for a very long time. It's an incredibly hard hypothesis to test empirically. I think the best evidence we have is for ungulates, where there's evidence that oral behaviors can help with digestive function because they help, for example, they might help produce saliva, they might help with the release of postprandial insulin, for example. So there is some evidence in some cases. And people with autism will sometimes report, doing behaviors that I call stimming actually helps me feel better. So it may be the case, but that doesn't mean the animals are okay, because I think we have to ask why on earth are they having to invent these bizarre behaviors in order to cope with what we do to them?
Yeah. Thank you, Georgia. We still have like 3 or 4 questions. Yeah. Oh my God. So there's a question here from Kat. Do groups of animals imply those housed in the same living environment. For instance, tigers in small numbers housed in zoos in separate living quarters. And if we see the problem across multiple zoos, is the possible assumption that the group is much broader and is represented by conditions across multiple zoos?
Yeah. So I think again, that's because when I mean at the group level, I don't literally mean animals are group housed. I mean an experimental group. If you look at subjects treated all the same way, if groups of subjects like that who manifest lots of abnormal repetitive behavior are showing you that their treatments have been bad. So if you see that tigers are often showing stereotypic pacing in zoos, and you can see that the risk factors are early loss of the mother, multiple transfers between zoos, not having a good relationship with the keeper, not being fed high levels, being kept in barren environments, the abnormal repetitive behaviors are telling you that those treatments were bad.
Also, a follow-up question to that is about cats. Do cats more generally do tend towards the withdrawn or quiet tendency, but at the
Yeah.
same time, ARBs are also very common in big cats?
Yes. So across the carnivores, it seems like animals with naturally large home ranges are at risk of showing abnormal repetitive behavior, particularly pacing. And it seems to be because those animals have evolved to relocate when basically local conditions aren't good. Something like a polar bear is constantly deciding, should I stay or should I go? Are there seals that I can eat here or do I have to move? Is there a female I can mate with here or do I have to move? Is there a dangerous male? Should I move? And so their response to tough conditions in the wild is to move, and that's why they develop stereotypic behavior. Little carnivores with small ranges, in contrast, have a different response to adversity. Basically, they make a territory and then they just stay there forever, no matter what happens. And that aspect of their natural lifestyle predicts being protected from stereotypic behavior in captivity. And I think that's why domestic cats typically don't show pacing. Um, on top, I think domestic cats, basically, they're a prey species as well as a predator. And it seems that very often they'll develop an inactive hiding response. You know, if a cat is chronically stressed, the cat will vanish. The cat will be in a box, under a bed, on top of a high thing. They're not pacing. Um, the one exception might be over grooming, actually. So over grooming is a repetitive behavior that you see in some felids. And I don't know that much about it, but I know it can sometimes be reduced by anti-anxiety medication. But yes, I think there are species that manifest its welfare in a different way.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah. So a question here from Deborah. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Georgia. Do you know of any reports on the occurrence of stereotypic behaviors in wild animals in their natural habitat?
Well, again, you hit the problem of definitions, but strange repetitive behaviors are occasionally seen. So apparently, if you put a running wheel in the wild rodents will use it only transiently. They'll have a go and then they'll move on. So even wild rodents will run on a running wheel a little bit. Wild primates will do apparently functionless kind of self-grooming, self-plucking responses if they're in a situation of social conflict. There have been anecdotal accounts of polar bears in the wild pacing if they can see prey, but they can't get to that prey, for example, because there's a crevasse in the way. So there's the odd little anecdote of transient repetitive behaviors. But what you don't see is repetitive behaviors performed over and over again in great long bouts day after day, week after week, month after month. Those seem unique to captivity.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And just two more questions, and that will be the end. So from Christina, a recent study, not actually a recent study, because a study, Major and Roberts 2014, if I get the question, reported wild mice running in the wild. What implications does this have? If it's something you're aware of.
Yes, this is the study I just mentioned, actually. So if you put wheels in the wild animals will transiently run in these wheels. I don't think it's that important, a study. Sorry, I know it's quite cool. The videos are quite cute. I don't think it indicates very much, really. Um, yeah, so you can get transient, apparently functionless repetitive behaviors even in wild animals, but I don't think it is the same as what you see in captivity in terms of underlying mechanisms or severity or duration. Yes, but thanks for bringing it up. Yeah.
So second to the last question from Samsudin, you mentioned bad environment. How do you define bad environment in captive settings such as zoos? It's an issue.
Okay, well, that's one reason why when you're validating welfare indicators, you have to lay your assumptions out. And that's what I tried to do with my tests at the beginning. So I would say a bad environment is one that the animal would escape from if you gave the animal the opportunity. If the animal shows you, I would prefer to have more food than I'm given. I'd prefer to escape from this threat. I would prefer to live in a different environment from this barren cage. Anything that's aversive, I'm going to say decreases welfare because we think one function of negative states is to promote avoidance. So if animals are trying to avoid something, I think we can say it makes them feel bad. So that's one way to identify bad environments. The other is to ask, does this environment expose animals to things that would threaten fitness in the wild? So, isolation, even if we don't have data showing that animals would prefer social company, to be isolated, if you're a social animal, not if you're a mink, but if you're a social animal, would be a disaster in the wild. You'd almost certainly die. So, assuming that affective states have evolved to be functional, affective states have presumably evolved to signal to an animal, you're on your own, you're in trouble, find your group, find your group, find your group. So I'm going to say animals exposed to threats to fitness, environments that represent threats to fitness are bad for the animal's welfare. That's how I would define a bad environment. Once we have well-validated indicators like abnormal repetitive behaviors or many other examples that you might use, those indicators too can identify bad environments. So we don't have to be subjective. We shouldn't be subjective. We should lay out the rules we're using to identify poor welfare environments, and those would be mine.
Thank you. And the last one here is, can we conclude that ARB are common in wild animals than in domestic animals?
Do you mean in captivity? I think so. Not wild animals in the wild. That means in captivity, I'm assuming. Um, and I don't know the answer to that. It's not a bad assumption in that domesticated animals have been selected to cope with the conditions of captivity. And wild animals, thanks for the clarification. For wild animals, being put in a small confined environment is completely evolutionarily novel. They've had no chance to evolve over generations. So I'm gonna guess yes, but I'm gonna say we don't know that empirically. So how would you test that? That would be the challenge. So then you'd want to compare Scottish wildcats with domestic cats, wolves with dogs, Burmese jungle fowl with domestic chickens, and you'd want to keep them in identical conditions. It would be a lovely study, and I think you're probably right, but nobody's done that as far as I know.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah. So that is the end of the questions in the chat. So to the audience, feel free to turn on your camera if you're comfortable doing that. We can take one or two comments from the audience. Kindly use the react button. If you actually want to speak directly to our speaker, use the react button and I will unmute you. And just a few announcements while I'm waiting for comments from the our participants. The next, which is the 15th virtual inaugural lecture, is coming up in 2 weeks' time. And this will be delivered by Professor Melissa Bateson of Newcastle University, and she will be speaking on the use of biomarkers in the assessment of animal welfare, telomere length as a promising candidate. So please, we would publicize this as well on our platforms. If you have not yet followed us on our LinkedIn, Facebook, we have also a YouTube channel where we upload our events. Please follow us. And on X, we are at AWGN 14. So I think Kate wants to say something. Kindly unmute, Kate. Yeah.
Hi, yes, hi. Hi, thanks for the presentation, and thank you, Georgia. It's so nice to see a presentation from you live. I've been following your work for many years, and this is the first time I've been able to join live, so it's really lovely.
Right.
I guess just elaborating on what you've been talking about being separated from a mother at birth type thing, but then you've also commented that the social species are at much greater risk, if they're removed from a social group, then that's going to be really highly detrimental. I guess what I'm positing is, wouldn't that be much the same for a non-social species to be removed from maternal care at a young age? Is that risk factor kind of similar, irrespective of whether they're a social species?
Yes, yeah. So they're two separate things. So one is losing a mother prematurely, or losing a father actually, if paternal care is what's normal for that species. So losing parental care early is one risk factor for fitness and therefore welfare. But then if as an adolescent or an adult, you're also social naturally, losing that social group would be a second hit on fitness. So they're two separate challenges. Sadly, for poor old research monkeys, they're often both happening to them. So that's why they may have seemed if they were being woven together, but they're separate. Does that make more sense? So even if you're a solitary species, losing your mum early is bad for fitness.
Yeah, hello, good afternoon, Ma.
Good afternoon here.
Yeah, I just want to appreciate our facilitator, Judge Mason, for the job well done. Thanks for doing justice to the topic. We are very grateful. In fact, I gained a lot from your presentation. Thank you very much. And to Dr. Yasiri, well done. Thank you very much. God bless you. Bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So with that, I say thank you to everybody for staying through the program. It's been an interesting one with a whole lesson to learn and a whole lot to digest, especially for those of us who are just trying to pick one or two things from this line of thought. And yes, it has been amazing, listening to Georgia make her presentation to us. Have a lovely day wherever you are, and be blessed. So Georgia, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate that. So